One of the kind of handy things you can do in this program, once you attach PDFs, is take notes on the PDFs in the program itself. So I'm going to open up a systematic review because I'm proposing a systematic review, and I would like to look at another one, look at their methodology, and also get a bigger sense of what I can cite for the background section of my proposal. So I've opened up this reference by Hill et al., and I will now click on the, nope, not attached file. I'm going to click on the PDF itself. Here we go. And I'm now in a 12-page PDF that has, it's the full article. And what I'm going to do is just extract a couple of key bits of information to help me understand. So I'm going to look just real quick at the abstract and say that they had 16 eligible studies. So somehow they set inclusion criteria to pull together 16 eligible studies. And what they were looking at, it seems, is design of health coaching interventions. So they were not looking at a specific outcome. In this case, since they're reviewing literature, it doesn't really matter to me where the researchers are because the articles could have been anywhere. So my first thing, I'm going to scroll down. You can see that I highlighted already in here. I always want to first find the little bit that's right before the method section that tells me what they were trying to do. So I've selected text here and selected the highlight tool to highlight the aim of the review was to apply a framework. So we're using a postcard framework. They're using the Calo-Ray framework to gather and analyze existing health coaching literature. So I'm looking at their aim, and then I scroll into their methods and I look at their data sources. So here are the databases that they searched, and it was pretty comprehensive. So I'm going to click with my mouse and drag right down to here, let go, choose my highlight tool, and boom, everything's highlighted. Now I'll scroll on up here, and I guess that's all the databases that they included, so that's good news. And they were looking for randomized controlled trials involving health coaching, health behavior change facilitation, or health behavior management and chronic diseases. And so they were indicating here they were trying to find all the papers that they could get their hands on. So, so far it would seem that this is going to be a really big review, but I want to scroll down next to the inclusion and exclusion criteria because they mentioned RCTs. So they're trying to slice out of the field somewhere in here in dealing with bias and saying there has to be randomized controlled trials. We don't yet know what the comparison groups are. All we know is that they were selecting studies that involve randomization. They put a limit here that I've gone ahead and highlighted, and that was the articles published in English between January 2000 and October 2012. That is a very, very narrow date range. Not sure why that is. They don't really provide any rationale. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of what did not get included here. They note participants of any age, and they did not limit outcome measures, but studies that did not report their outcome measures were excluded. So anything that was a feasibility study or a protocol, something like that, because there's nothing to really assess. So scrolling through my article itself, they're describing their how they organized they included some gray literature. We don't really have to worry about that. Or maybe they excluded it. Oh, they didn't search it. There we go. So this is pretty straightforward. They screen titles and abstracts. They examined full text of remaining articles, and then used a Calo-Ray taxonomy. So if I scroll down next, they have details for their included studies, and what they've provided is where it happened, what the aims were, who the population was, the theory or the coaching approach. And so this actually is pretty important for me because even though this is a review, I'm looking at this and I see that motivational interviewing, cognitive behavior therapy with stages of change, TTM is trans theoretical model, social cognitive theory, motivational interviewing, all of these are terms that I can pull into my operationalizing so I can capture studies if they don't use the word health coaching. So they have behavior change techniques that were used in the studies, and those are summarized here, and the main findings. So they list different countries, and I note that there's at least 2 references here in the US, And in providing the details, this is just a layout trick here, but I'm going to go ahead and scroll down in the article till I get to a little bit more information that will help me use this. So chances are good there are some references here that might fit my criteria. I'm going to hang on to that thought. They note a few things here that I think are pretty important for novice researchers. Study characteristics were summarized to provide an overview. Because of study variability, effect sizes were not able to be computed. So I'm going to highlight that, and that again will help me provide some rationale in my review for the narrative approach that I plan to take. I happen to know ahead of time, but we want to make sure we have some rationale. So in scrolling down to their results section, they do provide a schematic here. We want to just look real quickly at their at key components of this review, because ultimately we want to dig into our own review itself. But I'd like to point out a couple of things. So I don't know who Olson and Nesbitt are. We're going to ignore them. But the first heading that I see here is diversity in intervention approaches. And so if they found that in studies with this narrow a date range, it's likely that I'm going to find the same thing. I want to have that in the back of my head in not setting inclusion criteria that is so narrow. You'll also note here, this is just a nice example of methodological approaches embedded in the intervention within different formats. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this, but I'd like to point out how they're using their citations. And so they're using a narrative analysis and comparing and contrasting the studies. And so you see that with the references here. So the intervention was embedded in primary care for 2 studies. It was computer-assisted and internet-based for 2 studies, school-based for 1, and family coaching for another. So right away, when I look at that, I can surmise that some of these studies involve family interventions, some of them involve interventions for kids, some for adults, and probably the only reason they found so few studies, so I can come up here and say 16 results were deemed relevant for the current review. Chances are good there was something about their inclusion criteria that gave them such a narrow range when you're including studies on families and kids. So in reading the results section, this is where you really want to spend most of your time and not get mired in their methodology so much as looking at the characteristics of the interventions and what aspects of the interventions might account for some of the results. So in reading through, I can scan through for just a quick read to say there's diversity in intervention approaches. They note over here it becomes even more apparent when looking at the range utilized across this behavior change theories utilized across the studies. So that showed up in the table. They'll give you a little bit more analysis here, and a lot of what you need to do instead of highlighting the entire results section is really tease out key components. So here I'm just going to note there were inconsistencies in the definition of health coaching used in each study. That's kind of important. I think we're going to come upon that again and again and again. They note that most studies clearly identified it as health coaching, but not necessarily for purposes of the intervention. So that's probably pretty interesting to note. The intervention details, you don't really want to highlight this whole table, but this is something that I need to keep in mind for my inclusion criteria. Frequency of sessions, number of sessions, post-intervention follow-up. There they were looking at a 2-year publication window. Right now I have no window. I'm more interested in hypertension. But if I find 900 studies on hypertension and health coaching, one of the ways that I can cull the studies down is to look at the length of the intervention or the dose response. In order to make that determination, I really need to look more into the question of whether more is better in some of the interventions, whether larger samples are better, whether we know that there's a magic in behavior change at about 6 months, but is there any benefit to having a 12-month intervention? So these are the sorts of things I want to keep in mind when I'm really creating the criteria for my systematic review. The diversity in outcomes here is worth noting because they were just looking in general at health coaching. When I get to my review, I probably want to include some measure of hypertension. So that's something else that I want to consider rather than self-report. So last little bit here is the flow of the studies included in the review. And this will be important to manage as you go along when you identify your records through database search. And you seem to be missing the really big step here where you have a whole lot of articles that you need to assess. But when you're excluding articles and getting down to your magical number of 16, it's good to provide some rationale, whether it's duplicates, whether it's protocol papers, whether the intervention doesn't meet your criteria. So those sorts of things we don't really want to highlight. We just want to make sure that as we go through and just scan through the article the first couple times to take notes, you highlight what's important, and then we extract this information into a table for notes in our own analysis.